Hello, I'm Michael Brown, president of the School for Advanced Research. Speaking to you not from my office in the El Delirio campus, though thanks to the magic of virtual backgrounds, it would appear such, but I'm actually in Hoover House at Stanford University, where in a few hours I will present Professor Tanya Luhrmann with the 38th J.I. Staley Award, which is an annual book award given to books in anthropology by the School for Advanced Research. Before I invite Professor Luhrmann to join us to discuss her book, I wanted to say one thing about format. I expect that the interview will last somewhere between 40 and 45 minutes, after which we'll take questions via the Q&A panel in your Zoom screen, and I'll try to answer as many or ask Professor Luhrmann to answer as many as we can before we end, which would be somewhere between the 60-minute mark and the 75-minute mark. The book we're discussing, and for which Professor Luhrmann is receiving the Staley Prize, is entitled How God Becomes Real, Kindling the Presence of Invisible Others, Princeton University Press, 2020. The LA Times Book Review described it this way: provocatively orchestrated, meticulously argued, and lucidly written, How God Becomes Real gives all of us, whatever our own view of these matters, a lot to think about. Let me invite Tanya Luhrmann to join us.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here. And it's such a pleasure to have the honor of being awarded the Staley Prize. It's a remarkable list of people on that list, and I'm so delighted to join it.
Well, I'm glad you're here. We have a lot of questions, or I have a lot of questions, and I'm sure our audience has others. But let me just open by asking you to summarize the book in the broadest terms for viewers who aren't familiar with it. Your idea of the faith frame and what you call spiritual kindling, as well as the kind of discipline or training of attention that's required to more fully experience God or gods and to separate spiritual information from noise.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity. So the book tries to answer or explain the title, How God Becomes Real. It sets off, or it takes off from an ethnographic observation that I made, which is that people usually often talk about gods and spirits as sort of epistemically different in kind than the way they talk about the everyday world. So people may tell you, and what I mean by epistemically different is they treat it as not to be judged in the same way, and often as secondary to things they believe about the practical everyday world. So, for example, Christians will tell you, well, God can do anything, but they never ask God to feed the dog. They never ask God to write a term paper. They treat God as kind of set apart in some way. And if you listen to them, what they're really telling you often is that they don't believe in God enough. That they say, well, I should be praying always. And there I am in the car yelling at my kids. And I kind of forgot about God. I forgot I was trying to be like Jesus. Or I'm washing the dishes. And I really wish this could be an act of divinity and act of worship, and it's just not. And so what I did in the book was try to collect together things I'd known from, I don't know, 20 years of ethnographic research, complemented by some years of sort of using more psychological methods to look at just some of the things I'd seen about how God becomes real. It's not the definitive, I think there are many factors involved, but when I saw something about, what you might call talent. Some people are more able to enable the ideas, the stories, the understanding of God's to feel real to them. And I kind of start actually by describing ideas about gods and spirits as in a faith frame, framed in this different epistemic way, but as a paracosm, a set of stories that are sort of shared with other people that are accessible to some people, but sometimes more than others. And I say, well, look, I think there's a story about talent or talent. So some people who are more able to get absorbed in their imagination are more able to feel the presence of gods and spirits vividly. There's a story to tell about training, which in a Christian context we'd call prayer, but there are other ways of, we might call ritual in a different context. Things people do to pay attention to their minds and their world that help to make the gods sort of pop out. And there's some kind of story about how people think about thinking, how they think about their minds, because often I would say that many of the first person evidence experiences people have of gods and spirits really are sort of, however we understand the ultimate source of whether a god is actually speaking, there's something that happens with your thoughts that help the person who's having the thought feel like it's not really their thought, it's the voice of a god, or it's something given to you by God. And so a thought has to come to feel as if it's more outside of you. And so there's a story to tell about how we think about thinking. And I saw that probably the most moving thing I've seen ethnographically is that for people who really engage with these practices, God becomes more like a person. And I talk about all of these practices together as different ways of paying attention to inner experience, small acts of paying attention, like kindling, and sort of you kind of try to kindle a fire out of small things. And it can allow people to have this powerful sense that an invisible other is there engaging with them. And that can be very powerful and helpful for people. Not always, but it can be pretty powerful, pretty profound.
Well, as you've just said, a lot of the book focuses on these small everyday experiences of spirit that you call spiritual kindling, but you have less to say about more dramatic expressions of flamboyant expressions of spirit. I'm thinking of things like speaking in tongues or spirit possession. How do you understand are they simply an extension of what you've already discussed, or is there something qualitatively different about them?
So that's such a good question. So when I and my team, when we look at spiritual experience, we see roughly 4 kinds of events. Or actually, I think I talk about them in the book as 3 kinds of events. You have things that count as the spiritual experience of God that are moments which people identify that don't have an anchor in their body. So Christians will talk about hearing God speak through the Bible. And what they mean by that is that they're reading a piece of scripture and they feel different. They feel tired, they feel happy, they feel relaxed. And so there are a lot of different bodily experiences. And for any one person, that can be, a marker. And then so anyone who enters this world that can come to have the experience of God speaking back through the Bible. Then there are these experiences like ordinary human, often mental events, like having a thought or having a dream or having an image. And some of those can sort of pop out for people. And those are, people, they start to stand out and people say, oh, that was God who gave me that thought. And you've got to learn to do that. Not everybody has those experiences. Then there are experiences that are more striking and more anomalous. Hearing a voice when nobody's there, no human is there to have spoken, seeing a vision, and having an out-of-body experience. And those are a little more rare for people of faith. They also happen in the non-religious populations. There's something about the vulnerability of particular bodies to have these experiences. And then there's tongues and possession. Though both of those are experiences which, if you were a William James, you would say that they both depend on dissociation, some kind of human capacity to separate from everyday experience, to enter into trance. But what's striking about both of those phenomena is that they pretty much never happen to people ordinarily, sort of accidentally. So nobody who's not religious ever accidentally starts speaking in tongues. Nobody who's not religious ever accidentally gets possessed. And so those are experiences that sort of depend upon some kind of pre-existing cultural expectation. You can only do it if your body does that kind of thing. So not everybody can easily get possessed. And so possession is the experience of kind of being in your body. And it's sort of, somebody once said to me, it sort of feels like you step to the back of your closet and another person comes in and takes control. Tongues are really interesting. So most of the charismatic Christians I spoke to spoke in tongues. I could teach the listeners to this podcast how to speak in tongues. A pastor once said to me, just say, she should have bought a Hyundai quickly. You will sound like you're speaking in tongues. And tongues are kind of interesting. Tongues, they're sort of two kinds of tonguesiness. There is a pastor can turn to the congregation and say, pray, and everybody in the room can speak in tongues. But only some people in the room will be in a trance-like state, and often, and sometimes when they get into that state, they feel different. They feel light. They feel like the tongues can cure their cold. They feel like something's going through them. They feel almost possessed by the Holy Spirit. One of the things that's interesting about tongues is that in my work, tongues behaves a little differently than other spiritual experiences. Tongues and possessions behave a little differently because they're so dependent on the cultural expectation. And people can just do it. They can fake it, whether it's you can fake getting possessed. So you can do it. Anyway.
But there's something, this is one of the things I really wanted to ask you, because a lot of the book really focuses on individual psychological experience, quite rightly. But there is, the sort of collective effervescence, to use a Durkheimian phrase, of things that can happen just through the energy of the group that can obviously intensify or evoke things that people may not experience, just as you've said, may not experience just as individuals or walking down the street doing ordinary things in a way that they might see a very ordinary happening as having some kind of spiritual implication. So how do you feel about that, or what do you think about it?
Well, I think they're different. So that's why I think there are different categories of events. And some of the things I've tried to do in my work is to say, okay, like this talent. So I've got a measure for talent, the absorption scale, which is kind of odd that an anthropologist would use a scale, but it's sort of a systematic way of asking questions. And the absorption scale, it's a set of 34 statements, and you give it to somebody and you say, does this statement apply to you, true or false? And the statements are things like, sometimes I can change noise into music by the way that I'm listening to it. And sometimes I can sometimes I feel like I'm experiencing things the way I did as a child. Or sometimes I can watch a play or a movie and it's just like it's happening. I forget it's only a play or a movie. So the more truths somebody writes on the page, the more intense experiences they have, the more, and often the more vividly God or spirit can feel real to them, the more God or spirit can become a person. So possession and tongues it's sort of hard to capture the way in which absorption, the trait of absorption, facilitates tongues or possession, because people can fake it so much more easily. It's sort of like, does that make sense? It entirely depends upon the cultural context. Probably your talent for absorption affects how vividly you experience possession or speaking in tongues. But if you look at it in this kind of more, blunt empirical way, it's hard to see, whereas other spiritual experiences, are more obviously affected by talent and more affected by how much people pray. So, I mean, spiritual experience is complicated. There are different categories. I tried to ask, 20 questions that I thought people could answer. And I thought I could talk to them about them. I could sit and talk to them. You know, I stopped asking about mystical experience, William James's experience of when you have these moments. So there's real experiences where people, they feel suspended in space and time. They feel overwhelmed. They feel like they know something that nobody else in a new and different way than they've ever known before. They feel more themselves than ever before, but they also feel like they dissolve into the universe. The experience lasts for about 90 seconds, and it often changes their life. So these experiences are really, really powerful. But if you haven't had one, you don't know how to answer the question. So when I talk to people, I always say, what's the most important spiritual experience you've had? Tell me more about, you know, what stopped you in your tracks. And sometimes they talk to me about experiences like that, but you can't say, have you ever had an experience that in which, you know, you felt suspended in space and time, lasted for 90 seconds, and you felt you knew something completely different than ever before? Because people who haven't had that experience say, oh, that happens every day. And it doesn't. So it turns out you can ask a little bit systematically and comparatively about how people feel the presence of invisible beings, but there is so much we don't know. So much we can't ask about. For example, I mean, shall I perseverate for another?
Sure,
Okay.
of course.
So here's so Evans Pritchard, our favorite Evans Pritchard, saw a witchcraft light when he was doing his fieldwork among the Azande. So he was going out to pee one evening, and he saw, you know, the Azande said a witch travels by night as a white ball. Was that a spiritual experience? There are some people who say yes. You can see pictures of white lights in medieval paintings. There are people who report white lights. Is that an experience of an invisible other, or is that some kind of mistake people are making about actual lights? That's a really interesting question. We do not know the answer to that question.
For me, as an ethnographer, one of the most memorable and engaging parts of your book was your comparison of evangelical rituals and expressions of religiosity in Accra, Ghana, and Chennai, India, how different cultural situations lead to very different understandings of God and about the relationship of good to evil. Could you say a little bit about that, and how did that affect your thinking about this project in general?
I was so struck when I'd done this work with charismatic evangelicals in the United States, in Chicago and the South Bay Peninsula. And I started doing some comparative work in Chennai and then in Accra. And the churches were kind of the same. The theology was pretty much the same. The music was sometimes actually the same music. You could sometimes see the same books for sale in the bookstores. And you know, superficially, these were people who were thinking about God in the same way, but in fact, I thought it was really different. So I thought that in Chennai, first of all, there was something much more mystical about the way in which people were experiencing God as a father. There was much more talk about merger, about union, sort of had a Hindu caste or maybe a caste. You know, one of the things all ethnographers say about India in general and South India in particular is that interdependence, this involvement with a family is really, really important. And what was so striking in Accra was this ever-present sense of a supernatural evil, a sense that people were using the power of God to fight off this force that was pushing in from outside. People behaved to God as if their job was to exhort God, like they're in court and they are speaking to a judge. They're a lawyer exhorting a judge, and they presenting their case. They're expecting God to act. It wasn't quite cozy the way that Chennai God was cozy, and it wasn't the big teddy bear that Americans. I mean, these are blunt exaggerations, but in Chennai, sorry, in Accra, there was this vividness of shaking off supernatural evil. I mean, I remember being in the church once in a session that was devoted to fighting off the spirits of darkness, with like thousands of people jumping up and down, shaking off the evil from their hands. This powerful sense of fighting against these demonic forces. So, in some things we're pretty much the same. Everywhere people's talking about God, talking into their mind, God's giving them mental images, God's giving them dreams, God's, making it possible for the Holy Spirit to move through their body like a force. But the social context is pretty different.
Mm-hmm. Well, that leads to something that struck me about the book. You're very careful in the book. I mean, I think in general, you're rigorously neutral about the impact of this sense of spirituality. It probably tilted a little bit towards not a favorable, but just a non-critical assessment of it. And yet in a couple places, you acknowledge that for some people, it can really be disruptive and disheartening and difficult if the message of the spirits is irreconcilable with them, with their behavior, if they're gay and not straight, if they're this or that. On balance, would you care to say anything more about that? How you dealt with the potential negative effect of this kind of spiritual experience?
Let me start with this, blunt research, not my research, thousands and thousands, 2/3 Harold Koenig's research. I did a meta-analysis a couple of years ago, looked at 3,000 papers. Over 2/3 of them say that some, form of religious commitment, and these papers measure religiosity in different kinds of ways. But in general, religious involvement, on average, statistically speaking, better for your cardiovascular function, better for your immune function, makes you less lonely, makes you feel better about yourself. All that's, that's abundant research in the medical domain. It's also true that sometimes when you see people caught up with the idea of supernatural evil, it looks pretty scary. And I was particularly moved when I went through a period of talking to people in the States who had been evangelical Christians and then, for one reason or another, felt that they could not stay in those churches. And then there are those people, they'd use all these kindling practices to develop a really vivid sense of God, as sort of a person living inside them. And this is powerful. I remember talking to a person who said that when she left the church, she didn't think she could make a decision ever again, because in her experience, God made all her decisions for her. This is a very visceral sense of God. And when people left the church, because maybe they were more interested in using their bodies sexually, or they were attracted to the wrong sex from the point of view of the church, or maybe they disagreed with some of the church's politics, they could feel as if they were being strangled, like there was something inside of them they couldn't quite get rid of. And so, there's a whole world that taught people how to come to terms with the fact that they were leaving the church because it was so difficult. They actually used the word deconstruction, which has a different meaning for many intellectuals, but meant for these evangelicals, it meant how you take yourself apart and put yourself together again without that God. It's a powerful, deep process, and you don't do it overnight.
One of the challenging things for an anthropologist doing this kind of work, and I have some experience with it, is that the people you were interviewing, I'm hazarding a guess here, but I would imagine that some of them think you're on some kind of spiritual quest of your own. And I just wondered how you respond to that. I mean, when I was working with channelers, people assumed that I was a seeker. And of course, I was a certain kind of seeker, and I suspect I'm like you're a seeker, but I didn't come away ready to channel or to see my world as transformed. How do you feel about that? What do you come away from this project feeling.
It is true that particularly with certain kinds of churches, you have the distinct feeling that, you're after a book, you want to write a book, and they want your soul. And this is not an equal exchange. This is there's a power
Sure.
for their conviction. And there was a church where I began this work, and I moved away from the city because I took a job in a different city. But it was pretty hard to do fieldwork in that church because every conversation came around to like my walk with Jesus. But it's a little easier for me to do this work than it might be because I grew up in a Unitarian church. And so I grew up, and I also grew up betwixt and between faiths. So I was living in an Orthodox Jewish neighborhood, but my one grandfather was a pretty conservative Baptist pastor, and another grandfather was a Christian Scientist. And so, I just knew all these good people who had very different understandings of what was fundamentally real. And so I, for whatever reason, have been pretty comfortable in being in these domains and not wanting to say, it's real or it's not real. It's, I had this sort of pretty deep childhood experience that these are invitations to think about how to be a better person in the world. And that's got to be a good thing. And the supernatural stuff, we don't know the answer to that question.
So stepping back from this project, this book, How God Becomes Real, do you think that you were after this kind of question right from the earliest moment in your career? You reference your work with neo-pagans extensively, but that was a long time ago. I mean, how has your thinking about this evolved? You've obviously worked in a number of places and to great effect. Where, looking retrospectively, what do you think is your
The
motivation?
question of what is real, how people feel that they know, when that's good and when that's not so good, when what you imagine is good for you and when what you imagine is not so good for you. Those have been really guiding questions for me. And I think it comes, my dad was a psychiatrist. When I was young, he was really interested in people who were psychotic. And that word we use, or psychiatrists will use, to describe people whose thoughts and perceptions are radically, askew from reality. And yet here were all these lovely people I was interacting with who were interacting with what gods and spirits, and that seemed to make them very, very happy. And so, so trying to sort that out. My mother surrounded us with an imagined world with stories. She wrote many stories. We had a lot of let's pretend stuff in the home. And so trying to think about how humans sort that out has just been of enduring interest.
And maybe we should take some questions right now. I don't see it in the Q&A panel, but I'm happy to consider them. While we're waiting for some to come in, what's next? What do you see yourself working on? Are you going to extend this theme, or do you have completely new things that you'd like to work on?
So there are really two domains that I'm interested in. One is trying to figure out the relationship between these kinds of vivid experiences and madness. I don't think that all these experiences are sort of like a mild form of madness. It turns out that answering that question carefully is not trivial. The other thing I'm really interested in is what you might call an anthropology of mind. So I think that people represent how thought works in different social worlds in different ways. And one of the things that I really thought I saw was that when people imagine the mind world boundary is permeable, so that thoughts had their own kind of power, like thoughts could kind of slip out into the world and do stuff on their own, people had more vivid experiences of gods and spirits. And that was pretty interesting to me. So I so I was so those are the two directions I think I'll look at.
So we did have a question that came in just before the talk, and from Ron, and he asks, and I'm not sure that you have an answer for this, but is there a way to really assess these kind of experiences aside from the narratives and presumably also from the behavior of people you're speaking to, or are there, sort of different ways of really assessing the intensity, the direction of it?
Well, you can put people into fMRI machines and try to see, look at where the blood flow in their minds, their brains, what's happening. It's pretty hard to do that with most spiritual experiences because those experiences are fleeting and rare, and being in an fMRI is miserable and loud. We have done two projects led by postdoctoral researchers who worked with me. And we can see that both when people are speaking in tongues and where we studied a group of people called tulpamancers who aren't religious, but they kind of use sort of techniques that are like the way people of faith learn to pray. They learn techniques to create invisible beings called tulpas, and you can get their tulpa to show up when the human is in the fMRI machine. And both when people are speaking in tongues and when the tulpa takes over somebody's hand, and is using the human's hand to write, the same small region in the brain is deactivated. And this is sort of going beyond my level of competent scientific knowledge, but it's an area within the supplementary motor cortex. And it is striking. So there's something that's happening when the person is speaking in tongues, something is happening when the person is experiencing their tulpa vividly. I strongly am of the opinion that these spiritual experiences are not just ways of talking, they're powerful experiences that happen to people. And they are events in the body. And so, I think we actually now have quite a bit of data that's quantitative, based on, sending questionnaires to 2,000 people in internet settings like prolific, kind of like Amazon's MTurk. People sign up to do tasks. And we see a structure emerging of spiritual experience, so that I think there are like 4 or 5 bold different categories of kinds of events which behave in different ways in response to minutes prayed per day, in response to the way somebody performs on the absorption scale, in response to the way they're associated with different ways people think about their minds. So there is an emergent structure. So all that is true, and there are lots of debates in this corner of the intellectual world about whether these experiences, are really different from each other, or they're all kind of different expressions of a general kind of reactivity. There are many questions to ask.
Sure, yeah. There's a question from Kay Hagan who wonders about cults and how cults fit into the range of spiritual experiences. I don't recall any reference to cults in your book, but do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, there was a brief reference because I ventured into a cult at some point. Maybe it didn't make the final copy.
Oh.
But if you're working as an anthropologist, as well, and as many people in this discussion know, you need to be part of the world that you're trying to understand. And so I remember walking into something that I would call a cult, something called the Miracle of Love in San Diego. And it was kind of an amazing set of practices. I went to the public event, and in this public event, there were like 70 of us in the room. We each had a towel and a water bottle and a notepad, and and somebody went up to the front of the room, turned off the lights, and turned on this techno throb music and said, "Find your heartache and find God." And like almost everybody else in the room, started to sob, and they would sob for an hour, and then the music became babbling brook music, and then they danced for an hour, and then they, collapsed, and people were touching you, and they had an event where they did that for 9 days. And they would, and I went to their final, their celebration of the 9 days, and and the leader said, "Oh, they all look like little amoebas because their psychic skin is so thin." And I thought that was true. They all looked like they'd been through a very powerful psychological experience, and I did not want to go there. I did not think I would be fully able to be myself on the other end. And so I didn't go there. I mean, I can say certain things we know about, humans who have these experiences, they're always making a judgment. Is this real? Is this something that I believe because my friend believes it? Is this something that, when do people change their point of view about what's happened in the world? And we know that groups where people are tightly bound together, where they never leave the house on their own, where they never get an outside point of view, those are more likely to have points of view where people really diverge from the mainstream. At the same time, that's also a pretty good description of a monastery. So it's hard to have clear-cut distinctions between cults and powerful religious groups,
It's funny, I had an experience much like that long ago as an ethnographer in a self-help group actually in California, and just a weekend event. And it was very similar, and it was quite manipulative. I think not in a particularly harmful way, but the facilitators judged that I needed special help because I wasn't emoting as much as as everybody else, and which turned out to be ethnographically fantastic because I was always partnered with the most experienced facilitators, and by the end of some of these exercises, the entire ballroom would be covered with tissue paper from people crying. It was very much like you described it, and it was a reminder of just again this sort of Durkheimian impact of crowds, and having 100 people around you sobbing. How can you remain completely indifferent to that experience, especially if you haven't slept much or haven't, it is powerful.
And you really get the sense. Sometimes you go to I would go to one of these weekend charismatic Christian events, and the emotion in the room is so palpable. And it obviously people are experiencing themselves feeling good about it. And
Yeah.
and you can come to different points of view about whether this is good for people or not.
Well, it's cathartic, that's for sure.
Yeah.
So here's an anonymous question. What role does taking religious or biblical language literally play in what you heard as people describe these real experiences of spirit or God?
So I'll answer it. I mean, there are many paths down which one could walk. But one of the things that seems pretty important is that in the late 60s, a whole new movement of Christianity emerged because a bunch of hippie Christians paired up with Pentecostal preachers, and they decided to take the words of the gospel seriously. And when you look carefully at the gospel, Jesus spends a lot of his time getting rid of demons, and he does miracles, and he does a lot of healing. And so the group I spent most time with, the Vineyard, was founded by a man called John Wimber with sort of a right-hand guy called Lonnie Frisbee. And they, in effect, decided that there was something, the book of Acts was not a metaphor. I mean, you could be a conservative Christian and say, oh, that was a different dispensation, that was a different time in history. We don't do the miracles anymore. But these guys decided that no, miracles really happen. And they created the kinds of conditions under which people had very, very vivid spiritual experiences and began to persuade each other that these experiences were experiences of God.
Interesting. Here's a question from Paul Ryer, who is our Director of Scholar Programs at SAR. He says, thanks for the fascinating conversation. How might this work fit with religious groups, UUs, Universalist Unitarians, I assume, Quakers, perhaps Buddhists, who have distinct spiritual practices but don't emphasize God or divinity? Does it make a difference?
Well, then they have different kinds of experiences. So one of the things we found, for example, is that Thai Buddhists have fewer interior experiences than Christians, because Thai Buddhists are often surrounded by spirits, but they don't particularly want to talk to them, whereas Christians do. And so the pattern of their unusual experiences will differ. So there's a deep question here about what's the difference between the prayer-like practices that I saw among my pagans in London and the charismatic Christians in the US and Accra and Chennai, and the kinds of more Zen meditative practices that you might associate with at least with American Buddhism. And so you could say that one of these practices involves a lot of exposure to the imagination. People are working with their imagination, their minds. And the other practice is people are trying to, this is so much too blunt, but people are trying to kick the imagination out of their minds and empty their minds. And there is a question of whether these are the same or different practices. They're the same, and that they both ask people to turn from the everyday and focus in what, for want of a better word, I'll call interior space. They're different because it's a heck of a lot easier to do the imagination-rich practice. But there's a set of attentional practices that seem to change the sort of temperature of the inner experience, and the combination of the outside cultural expectations about what you should experience and the shifting vividness of your inner experience will create a pattern of spiritual experience. But these practices are powerful. You can pick them up and rework them for different ways. I mean, again, the tulpamancers start creating imaginary others with zero metaphysical commitments, and they're able to use these practices and change their experience.
So it's a question from John. It's interesting. He asks, have you found that people's various experiences are predominantly anthropomorphic, or do they personify spiritual forces, or depersonalize spiritual forces, or is it just vary according to the cultural setting?
I think it's pretty cultural there. So there's always this domain, this mixture between the capacities of the body and the ideas, the cultural expectations within the faith or the larger world in which the person is located. So there is some kind of experience in which people feel a rush of energy through their body. In my experience, like the witches and magicians in London would call that magical force. The Christians would call it the Holy Spirit. I have not encountered it as personified, but it may be part of what some people feel when they feel possessed. It's not the case that people people feel the presence of God. There are sometimes pieces of that experience that are, Saul on the road to Damascus. He heard God's voice. He had a vision. He also fell over in a fit. Those are different, when you ask somebody a question, those are the answers to 3 different questions, but they all happen at once. So does somebody ever feel the rush of energy through their body as a person? It could be. I don't know, but they're different. Like some people use the word affordance. That all Gibsonian idea that certain kinds of experiences in the body lend themselves to being interpreted in particular ways. A sense of presence, a sense that something sentient is sitting over there, that obviously lends itself to a person interpretation. A voice, for reasons I think this is a really deep question. Visions do not always lend themselves to the interpretation of a person. A voice almost always does. Smell and taste, I don't think they always do. But anyway, you get the drift.
There's a question from Linda Seligman, a fellow anthropologist, and she asks if you have shared or plan to share your findings with the people you interviewed and dealt with, and if so, how do they respond to it? I mean, the book is out in the world, and it's been out in the world for 4 years, so perhaps you're getting some comments from people who are involved. What do they say?
Mostly, the people who write to me like it. Right? So the Christians tend to like the idea that some people are better at doing the stuff than others because it helps them help people who come to church and who just feel like bad people because this stuff doesn't happen to them. There are people in these charismatic churches who feel that God doesn't love them because they're not feeling the Holy Spirit coursing through their body. So some people like that. The Christians who write to me and like the book like it because of that. Back in the day when I published my first book on pagans, people kind of loved to read through it and figure out who was who, because I carefully disguised everything.
Of course, yeah.
And they kind of like to see their practices described. I've gotten a couple of comments from Accra, and the people who've reached out really like the book. It's once I thought it was a very polite comment that they liked the book, and rather than a genuine comment. The risk that all of this poses for a person of faith, and I have heard back from some people who feel that this way, is that I sort of show the social and psychological strings of the puppet. And so if you were anxious, you could infer that I'm saying that faith is nothing more than the strings that are pulled where humans are creating this technology to enable people to have the illusory idea of an invisible other. And I guess my answer to that's what some people feel. My answer to that is that it's not my job to pass judgment about whether God shows up or not. The question of whether it's God has always been with people of faith. It runs throughout the Bible. The Hebrew Bible is full of, the Hebrew Bible makes it quite clear that people who are psychotic can nonetheless be the vehicles of God. And there are people who are psychotic who are not the vehicles of God. And there are people who say that they hear God and they don't hear God. And there are people who say that they hear God and nobody believes them and they did hear God. And so those are, I walk into a religious community and people disagree about how to interpret how somebody else is, what the ultimate source of somebody's experience is. And so I leave that, it's a very deep question, and I leave it to others to give their own answers.
The question of the anonymity of your consultants is a really interesting one, because on the one hand, maybe you've had this experience where people, you think you're doing them a favor, right? Or at least you're following normal practice by disguising their identities, and yet they feel when they see something that they know reflects their practice or what they actually told you, they resent the fact that they're not identified. They have a kind of ownership of their ideas. Have you had to deal with that at all?
Yeah, I remember having dinner. I read a book on psychiatry once, and really it was about the way that young psychiatrists came to see mental illness and the difference between seeing it as a biomedical condition versus seeing it from the perspective of psychoanalysis. And I had one composite figure in the book And then I had all these other individual figures. And I had in my own mind, sort of, I was doing this field work for a long time. And in my own mind, I'd created some people who were more like friends and some people who were more like participants. And so and I wrote more about the participants than the friends, even though the friends influenced everything that I saw. And I remember going out to dinner with somebody who I had put in the friend category. And she said very excitedly, "Who am I?" And I started off on this song and dance about, oh, you're a friend, and so you influenced everything. And she was devastated. And so I quickly had to backtrack and say, no, you're one of the you're one of 4 people in the composite figure, which was true. But it was, I was really struck by that, that it's exactly right, Michael. I mean, people want anonymity before the book comes out, and then once the book comes out, they want to be identified. They feel like, well, they played their role in this book.
Mm-hmm. I once had scheduled an interview with a fairly well-known channeler, and when I went to do the interview, she handed me a contract which said that not only was I obliged to identify her personally, but she had right of first refusal over what I said about our interview. And of course, I was completely flummoxed, and I kind of said something like, well, my shark will call your shark. And of course, I left and never followed up. But it was a lesson in this sort of tension between the anonymity, which, in some situations, you're protecting people from political harm, physical harm, and that's totally different. But this notion of authorship is important for some people.
Yeah. And can you hear that?
I did hear sounded like a bark.
All right, we have canine companions present, but
Okay.
there they are.
Well, Tanya Luhrmann, I want to thank you for the time you've given us. The book is How God Becomes Real, Kindling the Presence of Invisible Others, and I look forward to presenting you with the Staley Award in a matter of hours. Thank you for your hospitality and for your time.
I'm so honored. It's just been such a pleasure to be here in this conversation. Thanks.
And I'd like to thank the people who joined us too. This conversation will be up on YouTube in our SAR's YouTube channel in a matter of days. And if you couldn't catch it or you want to pass it on to friends, feel free to do that. To everyone, thank you very much.